few more verses that tell us a little more about the Palm Sunday story, this time from John's Gospel. Now the crowd that was with Jesus when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had given this miraculous sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him." Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the feast. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. "Sir," they said, "we would like to see Jesus." Philip went to tell Andrew. Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." My dear old mother used to say that everyone could remember where they were when they heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated. It was one of those moments that just defined and redefined history, and everyone knew what they were doing and where they were when they heard. I suppose the nearest equivalent for us, for our generation, would be the events of 9/11. Every one of us remembers where we were when we first heard, when we first saw the pictures of the destruction going on at the Twin Towers. The question I want to ask you this morning is, where were you on Palm Sunday? Where were you on Palm Sunday? Because it seems to me that one of the things about the story and the events and the characters of Palm Sunday is that each of us can see ourselves in one of the characters. So even if we weren't there, and obviously we weren't there literally, physically, we are there when the story is retold. And when we think about it, we know where we are. So my question to you is, where are you on Palm Sunday? There's lots of different characters we could look at, but I just want to explore four basic different groups of people and how they responded. And very helpfully, it does spell out the word palm for Palm Sunday, just to help us to remember. And the first one is the P. It's those who were praising, those who were praising. And that's the bit of the story we all know, isn't it? That's the famous bit of the story. The crowds that gathered and they laid the palm branches down and the cloaks down and they shouted Hosanna. It was marvelous, wasn't it? Except just 5 days later, those same crowds are the ones shouting, "Crucify, crucify." I wonder what Jesus would say to those crowds, to those people who praise Jesus on a Sunday, but disown him on a Thursday, or worse still, are baying for his blood. I think he would say that praising is not the answer, important though it is. It's not about the confession of our lips, although that is important, but it's not primarily about the confession of our lips. It's about the commitment of our hearts. And the crowds on Palm Sunday, they got caught up in the moment. They got caught up in the atmosphere. They got caught up in the celebration, and it was marvelous. But when Jesus turned out not to be who they thought he was, they didn't want to know. When it turned out he wasn't going to boot the Romans out, when it turned out that he wasn't coming in as some military king to set up and restore independence to Israel, when instead he wanted to speak about a kingdom of peace and forgiveness and reconciliation and kindness, people didn't want to know. They praised Jesus as long as they thought he was what they wanted. But when he didn't do what they wanted, they didn't want to know. Do you see yourself amongst those who praised on Palm Sunday, but didn't want to know a few days later. And then, secondly, there were those that asked. That's our A, those that asked. There was all this uproar, there was all this celebration, there was all this praise, there was all this commotion. And the crowd said, "Who is this?" And the answer was, "This is Jesus." And what did those crowds do with that? As far as we could tell, absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. If the crowds that praised, that worshipped, had a praising interest in Jesus, those that asked merely had a passing interest in Jesus. And we can be guilty of that as well. We're interested, but we're not really committed. We might come now and then when it suits us, maybe special occasions, Christmas and Easter, maybe the anniversary of the loss of a loved one, when it suits us. Perhaps those who ask and take no further are actually not so dissimilar to the praising ones. Because basically, the praising people only wanted to know Jesus as long as he was who they wanted him to be. Those that asked, those who just had a passing interest, they were only interested in Jesus when it suited them. What about us? Do we see ourselves like that? We only follow when it's convenient, when it suits us. Then the L brings us to the third group, and this is probably the most positive. Those who were looking. Those who were looking. The Greeks, they weren't Jews, that's the point. They weren't Jewish people, but they'd come up to the feast anyway. So they had a strong interest in the Jewish faith. And so if the first people had a praising interest and the second group had a passing interest, at least these people had a pursuing interest, because they were prepared to go up all the way to Jerusalem to join in the festivities, even though they weren't Jews themselves. They were looking, they were seeking. And what is their request? They said, "We want to see Jesus." I know of one church that had that inscription in the pulpit. So when you went into the pulpit to preach, there in front of you, laid out in big letters, was the words, "Sir, we would see Jesus." A reminder to preachers of what the people needed. And it's said that during lockdown, many more people than normal have started to tune in online, to YouTube, to Facebook, whatever, to do online alpha, because the pandemic has made people stop and question all the things that they were so sure of before. It's made people realize the frailty and shortness of life, and that we can't take things for granted. And people have begun looking for something more. Now, whether that will translate into people coming to full faith, whether it will translate to people becoming disciples of Jesus and getting involved in a church, I don't know. It's a positive sign, though. It's an encouraging sign. But the question I want to ask is this: do we have that same attitude? Sir, we would see Jesus. Is that what we want? Is that what church is about for us? Because it's very easy for church to become about all sorts of other things that are really interesting, but to lose sight at the heart of it, that the church exists because of Jesus and for Jesus, and to make us more like Jesus, and to help us walk more closely with Jesus. Is your prayer for our church, for the worship, for the prayers, for the preaching, for the communion, "Sir, I would see Jesus"? Is that what's in your heart as part of Herne Bay Baptist Church? Lord, whatever else we do as a church, I want to see Jesus more clearly. I often use the words of that famous old prayer, "Lord, that I would see you more clearly." love you more dearly, and follow you more nearly day by day. And in this pandemic, are you looking just to get through it? As many of us are. Sometimes it's just, just get through one day at a time. Life's like that. But is your prayer, Lord, through all of this, through all the difficulty, through all the hardship, through all the struggle, Lord, I would see Jesus more clearly. So we thought of those who had a praising interest. We thought about those that just asked and it didn't go any further. We've looked at those who were looking, who were seeking for Jesus. And that brings us to the last group, to the M. And it won't surprise you, this is the Pharisees. And folks, they were just interested in meddling. They were meddling. They wanted to get rid of this man. He was making them look bad. He was basically setting up an understanding of God and of the Torah and of the Jewish faith that actually made the Pharisees, who were supposed to be the heroes, it made them look like the villains, because what Jesus was teaching was that, in fact, they'd missed the point. That they got so obsessed with outer religion, with conforming to the outside things, that they'd actually lost the heart of a faithful, loving relationship with a merciful God. And that's the meaning of actually the verse that God used to call me into ministry many, many years ago, when he challenged the Pharisees, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And the Hebrew word there is hasid, which means loving kindness or loving faithfulness or loving devotion. And it's a word that speaks of an inner heart attitude to God. But the Pharisees were interested in sacrifice, all the religious stuff, getting the outside stuff right. And that set them on a collision course. And the Pharisees, as you know, decided they had to get rid of this guy. And you know, there are still people like that in the church today. They're quite comfortable with religion as long as God doesn't show up and try and do anything. And we can laugh at that. But, you know, sometimes we can be guilty of that. We get very comfortable with church as we know it. We get very comfortable with the Christian life as we know it. And then God comes along and shakes things and challenges things. And it's very easy to start meddling like the Pharisees. How can we get rid of this? Instead of saying, there's something new here I need to embrace. Here's an area where I need to grow. Here's an attitude where I need to change. I'm reminded of the famous parable that Jesus taught. You remember about the farmer who said, wow, I've got such a bumper harvest. Oh, I don't know what to do with it. I'm going to tear down my barns. I'm going to build bigger barns. I'm going to fill them with this harvest. I'll have enough to last for years. I'll take it easy. I'll retire. I'll put my feet up. I'll say, yeah, I've got good things stored up for me. And Jesus said, and God said to that farmer, you fool, tonight your life will be required of you. What then will happen to all of this that you've stored up? And I remember hearing, it was down at Battle Baptist, down Hastings Way. I remember hearing a preacher preach on this, and I've forgotten everything else he said except for this one comment. He said the problem with the farmer was he didn't need a bigger barn. He needed a bigger heart. You know, and that was the problem with the Pharisees. They got the outside right, but they'd got the inside completely wrong. Do we see ourselves in that? Their response, instead of repentance, was to plot murder. And sadly, there are still people in the church today who, when they don't like what God is doing, will try and murder a work of God rather than respond in faith. So those who were praising, but their praising wasn't sincere, it didn't lead to devotion. Those who were asking, but it didn't go any further, it's just when it suited them. Those that were serious, those that were looking for Jesus, they wanted to see him. And those that just wanted to meddle because God was getting in the way of their nice religion. There are other characters we could have looked at as well. You could almost argue, they say of London, don't they? All of human life is here. Do you know, I would say the same is true of the events of Palm Sunday and Holy Week. all of human life, all the attitudes, all the conniving, all the responses, all the good, the bad, and the ugly can be found in the events of those last few days of Jesus's earthly life. The question is, where did you stand on Palm Sunday? What's your response to the Jesus that marches not just into Jerusalem, but wants to march into your life and say, I am the way, the truth, and the life? Let's be quiet for a moment. I normally pray at this point, but let's just be quiet and just have a minute to reflect.